I don't need to tell you the depravity of war. You are all too familiar with its images, with the refugees of war, with information that we have revealed showing the everyday squalor and barbarity of war. Information such as the individual deaths of over 130,000 people in Iraq. Individual deaths that were kept secret by the US military, who denied that they ever counted the deaths of civilians. Instead, I want to tell you what I think is the way that wars come to be and that wars can be undone. In democracies, or the pseudo-democracies that we are evolving into, wars are a result of lies. The Vietnam War and the push for US involvement was a result of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. A lie. The Iraq War famously is a result of lies. Wars in Somalia are a result of lies. The Second World War and the German invasion of Poland was a result of carefully constructed lies. That is war by media. Let us ask ourselves, of the complicit media, which is the majority of the mainstream press, what is the average death count attributed to each journalist? When we understand that wars come about as a result of lies peddled to the British public and the American public and the publics all over Europe and other countries, then who are the war criminals? It is not just leaders, it is not just soldiers, it is journalists. Journalists are war criminals. And why one might think that that should lead us to a state of despair, that the reality that is constructed around us is constructed by liars, is constructed by people who are close to those that they are meant to be policing. It should lead us also to an optimistic understanding, because if wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by truth. So that is our task, and it is your task. Go and get the truth. Get into the ballpark and get the ball, and give it to us, and we'll spread it all over the world.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Julian Assange's speech on October the 8th, 2011 applies to today's political environment more than ever. The war criminals are not only the lying, talking heads, the politicians, the leaders, the soldiers, but also the journalists who provide the cover for these wars. The Syrian composer Marcel Saba sent me this remix that he made of Julian Assange's speech 12 years ago, and he allowed me to post it and use it as an intro for Syriana Analysis. So thank you so much, Marcel, for your, first of all, remixing and creating this remix. The link of this music, guys, the remix is in the description below if you would like to listen to it again or spread it around. So, as Julian Assange predicted and said, that the journalists are also they share the responsibility for these wars, but they are also honest journalists, and they are journalists who are not war criminals. One of them is my colleague and my friend Vanessa Billy. She's an independent journalist, investigative journalist based in Syria, and I am happy to call her also a friend. I hope that today the internet in Syria is good enough so that we can communicate. I know the situation. How is it in Syria? And unfortunately, we heard two separate news, which I think they are also interconnected with each other, since this Gaza onslaught now and with the Syrian involvement with this regional dynamics. The HDS or Al Qaeda attacked on northern Latakia, and also ISIS sleeping cells attacked against the Syrian army position in the desert, and they murdered over 30 soldiers. So before I jump into what is happening in Gaza and the topic that we will address and speak together, uh, maybe you can tell us what happened exactly. Do you think those are coincidences? Who are the parties and the powers moving this chess all the time when there is a geopolitical conflict in the region, and all of a sudden this ISIS and Al Qaeda cells are activated as if somebody is pushing a button and telling them to attack Syrian army positions?
Well, of course, the UK is responding of the holding camps for the ISIS fighters. I think around 15,000 ISIS fighters and their families that are being held in the northeast of Syria. We have multiple reports, of course, of US occupation forces moving ISIS fighters around. We know they're also being trained in the Al Tanf military base in the southeast on the border with Jordan and Iraq. And also being recruited in the Rukban so-called refugee camp, which is just to the south of Al Tanf. And so for me, during the height of the war against the terrorist factions that were inserted into Syria by the Western Alliance and their Gulf allies, and of course supported by Turkey, a NATO member state, and Israel, when we saw the Syrian Arab Army closing in on the terrorists, whatever denomination they were given, whether it's Al Qaeda or Al Sham or ISIS, we saw Israel often carrying out aggression against Syria in support of the armed groups. Now, of course, what we're seeing is Israel embroiled in what is effectively the climax of the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians that began in 1948 and has never really stopped. We're seeing the terrorist groups in Syria, all of which are under control of the US or Turkey in particular, but also of Israel. Israel provided funding, arms, hospital treatment for the various armed groups, particularly in the southern sectors of Syria. And so, of course, in response to the Islamic resistance targeting US bases in Iraq and Syria, we see the US not only bombing directly, as it has done also in the last 48 hours, but also ISIS being triggered to carry out the attacks against Syrian Arab Army positions. And of course, this has been the situation for some time. There was a RAND paper, I think, in 2017, which talked about the new warfare, which was swarming, where basically these smaller cells of militia would be established that would carry out isolated attacks against military and civilian positions. And of course, we saw this again after the earthquake or the double earthquakes on February the 6th. We saw then that ISIS was triggered to further destabilize Syria, attacking civilians and military. And that's been ongoing for really most of this year, Kevork.
Yes. You recently, Vanessa, if we want to move back to Palestine and Gaza, which is the focus of the world nowadays, you published a new article on your Substack. This is the article, guys. I just want to expand it here for you to see it clearly. the Hamas Human Shield Justification for Israeli War Crimes. Guys, the Substack of Vanessa Bele is in the description below. She's usually publishing her reports, investigations, and analysis on her Substack. X is, again, it's being suppressed, so she's expressing her opinions and also investigations on the Syrian case and other cases in the region on her own Substack. The Hamas Human Shield Justification for Israeli War Crimes, you say the Zionist projection is the default Hasbara strategy, and then you quote the Foreign Minister or Secretary of State of the United States. I just want to show what the Secretary of State of the US said in this regard so that we can deconstruct what he said and address his statement in this regard. Let's take a look together first.
And of course, what separates Israel, the United States, and other democracies when it comes to incredibly difficult situations like this is our respect for international law and, as appropriate, the laws of war. We do everything we can to make sure that in these situations we avoid civilian casualties. That is in direct contrast with Hamas, which uses people as human shields. It actually seeks to put Palestinian civilians in situations where they could be harmed. This is very much part of their game plan. So we know that Israel will take all of the precautions that it can, just as we would. And again, that's what separates us from Hamas and terrorist groups that engage in the most heinous kind of activities.
So the narrative here is clear: us against them, them the barbarians, us the civilized world. Today I was checking the death toll in the Gaza Strip, and the death toll is close to 10,500 dead civilians, of which we have over 4,000 dead children. The first question that comes in my mind here is, how does this prove Blinken's claim of Israeli adherence to international law and the us versus them rhetoric?
Yeah, it's quite incredible, isn't it? It's almost as if we care about our children, but Palestinians don't. That's effectively the message that's going across. As Julian Assange said in the video that started off this chat, wars are started by lies. And in my opinion, this genocide against the Palestinians, as I said, the climax of what began in 1948, the ethnic cleansing of what is left of the West Bank and the Palestinians inside the Gaza concentration camp, was started by, in my opinion, three lies. One is the one that is the most prevalent in every single Western discourse about Israel, is that Israel has the right to self-defense. Well, Vasily Nebenzia made it very clear that as an occupying force, Israel has the right to ensure the security of civilians, including Palestinian civilians living under its occupation. Yes. But it doesn't, under international law, the ICC ruling, it doesn't have the right to actual self-defense. So that's one lie that is largely debunked, not only by Nebenzia, but also by Richard Falk, a human rights lawyer who's very experienced in the Palestinian cause. Then you had the Hamas atrocities, again, which have largely been debunked, both by hostage testimony, by the testimony of people that were at the rave, were caught in the crossfire when they were fired upon by the IOF forces themselves. There's been recent videos released actually by the IOF which show helicopters firing on unidentified targets and cars, so both civilians and cars, for, I think it was 4 hours, targeting over 300 targets. And then you have the video footage of the remains of the cars after this attack by Israeli Apache helicopters. And it becomes quite clear that the devastation and the incinerated bodies that were found after October the 7th were as a result of the Apache helicopter attacks, not as a result of the resistance taking of hostages, which is you know, a perfectly acceptable campaign plan to take hostages as negotiation to achieve some kind of release of Palestinian hostages, well, prisoners, more than 5,000 held in Zionist jails. And of course, to negotiate the blockade on Gaza, etc. Then, after 3 days, of course, or 2 days, the Israeli tanks fired on the buildings where the resistance factions and the hostages were taking shelter, again killing both hostages and resistance militants. So that's the second lie. The third lie is Hamas used human shields. Now, the human shield narrative is something that has run through Zionist and Western aligned propaganda since 1948 onwards. Interestingly enough, who actually started the system of human shields were the British, under the British mandate, which ran from 1922 until 1947. During the 1930s uprisings by the Palestinians against the influx of European Jews to effectively dispossess Palestinians of their land, under the auspices of the Zionist movement, and of course managed by the British colonialist settler organizations and military. The British started to use Palestinians as human shields during those uprisings. So that's where it began. It then continued. I think B'Tselem, which is one of the most foremost Israeli human rights organizations, has stated in various documents that it began in earnest after 1967, after the Six-Day War, that Israeli forces began using Palestinian children in particular, but some adults, as human shields in various areas of tension or conflict.
Yes. By the way, guys, when Vanessa was mentioning that Israeli side was firing against the cars where they were suspecting that there were hostages inside it, this was called the Hannibal Doctrine in the Israeli army, that it is better for them to kill the hostages and quote-unquote terrorists instead of allowing them to take a hostage to the Gaza or any other area. This is a military practice in the Israeli army. And today I was watching this video. Israel admits Apache helicopters fired on their own civilians running from the Supernova music festival. Quote, the pilots realized that there was tremendous difficulty in distinguishing within the occupied outposts and settlements who was a terrorist and who was a soldier or civilian. The rate of fire against the thousands of terrorists was tremendous at first, and only at a certain point did the pilots begin to slow down the attacks and carefully select their targets. This is a video, as you can see. So I'm personally not denying that there are civilians died in the festival, or probably in a crossfire, or probably from Hamas. But there is also evidence now, because of the footage that we see. Especially yesterday, they published a drone footage of the aftermath of the parking lot of the cars and the destruction that was inflicted on the cars. This is not an AK-47 destruction. These cars were damaged by either artillery shell or tanks or an Apaches. So there is also a real possibility that these helicopters, they actually resorted to the usual practice of this Hannibal practice, and they started shooting against the Hamas militants when they were trying to also bring the hostages to the Gaza Strip in order to exchange them with the Palestinian hostages. For those who do not know, there are over 5,000 Palestinian hostages held by the Israeli side. Those are thousands. Numbers are huge. There are hundreds of them for years without a trial, and there are also underage kids who never received any sentence by any Israeli court or administrative court, because they call this an administrative court. Now, there is so much talk, Vanessa, about genocide. People are speaking about the genocide, ethnic cleansing in the Gaza Strip. The ethnic cleansing is clear that they're pushing the people from the north to the south in the hope that they would be forced to go to the Egypt, so they cleanse the Gaza Strip from the Palestinians. But when we say genocide, for example, can cutting off of water, food, fuel, and electricity constitute a genocidal policy, in your opinion, in this regard? Because there is so much backlash and controversy about the term genocide nowadays.
Well, I mean, I don't think you can have a clearer cut example of genocide, and plus the fact that the Israelis themselves have admitted that this is an ethnic cleansing. It is effectively a genocide. There have been 2 papers released, one by a think tank, one by the Israeli intelligence agencies themselves, describing how their plan is to effectively ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from Gaza into the Sinai and to create a 7-kilometer sterile zone, which is just about the most inhuman way of describing a buffer zone to prevent Palestinians from coming back to their territory. So, this is nothing more than the continuation. People tend to call it Nakba too, but I tend to think this is a continuation of what happened in 48 and 67, and what has been ongoing, a creating of a life that is without dignity, without any kind of civilian infrastructure or services or any kind of, it's an apartheid state, right? Even the occupied territories, it's apartheid. So under every single human rights convention, what Israel has been doing to the Palestinians violates human rights, it violates rules of war, it violates international law. On all levels. And yes, the word genocide, well, I don't know if it's overused or if that is simply a way of preventing us terming what the West is doing to multiple countries as a genocide. Look at, for example, what's happening in Yemen since 2015. I would also describe that as a genocide, right? It's the incessant bombing of Yemeni people, the blockade and siege of Yemeni people. Of course, it's on a larger scale, but Gaza is literally a concentration camp. I mean, you sent me the video of the interview between Chris Williamson and Julia Hartley-Burr, where she's extremely upset that he calls it a concentration camp. But I don't. I looked up the dictionary term for concentration camp, and it qualifies absolutely. Israel, when I was in Gaza in 2012, Israel controls the water, electricity, fuel, food. At one point, Israel was only allowing in 2,000 calories per day for every civilian. That's the extent to which it controls it. But during every periodic aggression, what does it do? It destroys the infrastructure. It destroys Gazan ability to, for example, process sewage. So even when I was there and it was raining heavily, kids were walking to school in rivers of raw sewage. Sewage was basically being poured into the go to have some kind of break from the trauma of living inside Gaza. And Julia Hartley-Burr made the point, well, it's not as if they're gassing the people in Gaza. Well, is bombing them with more than the bombs used in Hiroshima not enough? And they have talked about sending gas into the tunnels. I mean, you reported on this, I reported on this, right? The heritage minister has talked about nuking Gaza, and he hasn't really been heavily reprimanded for using such terminology.
Vanessa,
Describing this. Sorry.
I was going to ask you about the Minister of Heritage who said the nuking the Gaza Strip is on the table, and he said that maybe they have to send the Palestinians to Ireland or to the deserts. So in these sentences, there are three things here. One is nuking the Gaza Strip, which is I'm not surprised at all that a minister from this Israeli government is calling for nuking this. I already addressed that, but there are two things here. To the deserts. You know, in the Middle East, when you say go to the deserts, it's like you are giving the impression that you belong with the camels. Go to the tents,
Yeah.
go to the desert. So it implicates also blatant racism here. But why Ireland? What is wrong with Ireland
I think
for Israel?
I think because Ireland has a very long history of supporting the Palestinian cause. There was recently a Sinn Féin member of the Irish Parliament speaking out against what Israel was doing to the Palestinians, and not only inside Gaza. You know, people forget what is happening right now in West Bank, which is effectively another form of ethnic cleansing, blockading areas like Jenin and Nablus, carrying out summary executions, destroying infrastructure and places of worship, bombing. But there's no Hamas in Jenin or Nablus, right? But it's still ongoing. For me, this is clearly for Israel the opportunity for them. And I think right at the beginning, Biden made it very clear, didn't he, that we should finish this. So in other words, we should ensure that Israel is for Zionists, for Israelis only. And in fact, I think it was the Arab language service that showed the hand holding the map of Israel with only the Israeli flag on it. So in other words, that the territory should be cleansed of all non-Israeli peoples, right?
Yes. Vanessa,
So I think that the Irish thing is because Ireland has a long history of supporting the Palestinian cause.
especially the people I've seen lots of support from the Irish people, more than like I'm not speaking about the government or administration. And in your article you said the Hasbara strategy. I'm seeing a lot of people using this term recently on social media platforms. What is Hasbara? Is it a Hebrew word? What does it implicate? What is the meaning of Hasbara strategy, since we're speaking about it?
I think it is a Hebrew word. It's basically the propaganda that supports Israeli policy, put very simpler. So it's their propaganda complex, in other words. And it's a very powerful one.
It says Hasbara was formally introduced to the Zionist vocabulary by Nahum Sokolov. Hasbara is a Hebrew word, has no direct English translation, but roughly means explaining. It is a communicative strategy that seeks to explain actions whether or not they are justified. So justification, let's say. Yeah, so let's say it's a justification for the crimes of the Israeli side, and those are the ones that are being used to, for example, when they bomb a hospital, when they bomb an ambulance, when they bomb a school, and every time I'm seeing the Israeli side, they have three steps that come always in 2 days. The first day, they deny that the bombing happened from the Israeli side. They blame Hamas instead. And the second day, they say, no, they bombed a senior Hamas operative without naming who is this person and without saying whether they killed this operative or not. And then thirdly, they release tapes which are very, very laughable, in my opinion, for anyone who understands Arabic. Two people are speaking together, probably in one of the Israeli propaganda rooms, just recording some voice notes, and then they're sending it to each other, and then this is the evidence of Israel. So every time they bomb an ambulance or bomb a hospital or any civilian infrastructure, then you can just release a tape to people speaking in Arabic and say that, look, those are two Hamas operatives, and this is the evidence, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it was journalist Sam Husseini that either today or yesterday he questioned the U.S. State Department spokesperson. If Israel is claiming that they are targeting these hospitals and schools and ambulances because there are Hamas operatives somehow hidden inside these school, hospitals, UNRWA centers, refugee centers, and ambulances, then how many Hamas operatives has Israel actually killed? And of course, there was no response, because there's not even a claim. And Hamas is, of course, it's obvious, Hamas is going to say they haven't killed any, but somewhere in the middle is if they have killed 2 or 3, yet they've dropped the equivalent to 2 atomic bombs on Gaza to do so. And they have leveled entire residential areas, not even just buildings, areas. They've been using, apparently, according to recent reports, seismic bombs, thermobaric bombs. They've been using white phosphorus. So people that are trying to dig bodies out of the rubble are coming away with cuts covering their hands, which somebody told me, that's a normal reaction to white phosphorus on residue on the rubble itself after it's been used to bomb. And Gazans know what white phosphorus looks like. You know, it's been used against them since 2008, 2009, and it's been heavily documented. As has, as I said, the use of human shields by Israelis, not only in the occupied territories where it's more prevalent, but also in Gaza, particularly during the 2014 war. And yet evidence of Hamas using human shields is virtually non-existent. Even the BBC, Jeremy Bowen, and the Belfast Telegraph in 2014, during the Israeli aggression in 2014, utterly denied having seen Hamas using human shields. And Gaza is a strip of land 40 kilometers by 12 kilometers with a population of 2.2 million. You know well enough, even in Syria, with some of the national defense forces here. I mean, I've been in some of the Syrian Christian towns bordering Idlib when they're under attack. And it's incredibly difficult. The rocket launchers for the national defense forces are close to residential areas because they're small towns, right? It's very difficult to avoid it. So in Gaza, it's virtually impossible to avoid rockets being launched from areas that are close to residential areas. And if you look at where Tel Aviv, for example, where the Israelis place their military centers in Tel Aviv, they're in the middle of an area where there are multiple residences and also a massive shopping mall. So the hypocrisy is incredible, right? No one ever points the finger at Israel, but always at the Palestinians, because they are to be dehumanized like this. They are, of course, the non-human animals as described by various authorities in the far-right Israeli government. And in 2018, the US brought out a bill, the Sanctioning Use of Civilians as Defenseless Shield Act. They're now calling for Biden to impose sanctions on Palestine. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work, because they're already starved and deprived of virtually every resource that should be available under human rights law, right? But where are the sanctions against Israel for documented and archived evidence of them using children as human shields, even 2 or 3-year-olds in 2023? And Breaking the Silence, which is an organization set up by IOF soldiers to document the crimes by the IOF against Palestinian civilians. They also have recorded multiple occasions when Palestinians have been used as human shields. So it's well documented. So where are the sanctions? Where is the prosecution of Israel for the violation of, international law? I mean, I know it's a rhetorical question, but
yes, but Vanessa, it's not only about the political class, but also the journalistic class. And at the beginning, when I played this video from Julian Assange, now I'm going to play this video on Talk TV. This video that you were also you referred to. I really want your comment and your opinion on the journalist, not the content, not that he called Israel an apartheid or Gaza concentration camp. I really want your opinion about the journalist, her attitude, her behavior, and her journalistic ethics. And what does this constitute, in your opinion? Let's, guys, watch this together. I think it's mind-blowing.
Who do you think a ceasefire would benefit? Because the concern is, by those who are not calling for a ceasefire, including Keir Starmer and the Prime Minister of the Conservative government as well, is that actually a ceasefire only benefits Hamas, who can rearm, reorganize themselves, and then can continue their attacks on the Israeli civilian people. Do you think that actually a ceasefire will in any way benefit the ordinary people of Gaza, ordinary civilians, including children?
Well, they're being massacred on a daily basis, Julia, at the moment. So, of course, a ceasefire would be beneficial to the people living in Gaza, which is, let's remember, is a concentration camp.
It's not a concentration camp.
Well, I'm sorry,
How
Julia.
dare you use that phrase? How dare you?
Well, I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry. Are Palestinians working gas chambers in Gaza?
Julia, what is the definition of a concentration camp?
I'm just so appalled.
People are penned in. They
you
are not
seem
allowed
like
to
a
leave.
normal person.
Nobody is allowed
you seem
to go
like a normal person with normal values.
They have a fence around them.
And
they
yet
are they are regularly bombarded by the Israeli regime. What an absolute outrage. And how you can defend a regime which is behaving worse than Nazis, actually, in some respects.
Worse than Nazis. There we go.
Yes,
worse
absolutely.
Than Nazis.
Because what we are seeing, thousands of children are being murdered by this Israeli regime.
Why don't we just save time? Why don't you just come on this show and just shout, I hate Jewish people, and save everyone time?
What do you say about the Jewish people then that have joined the rallies in marches in support of a ceasefire, in support of the Palestinian people? What do you say about them, Julia? Because there are thousands of Jews who are utterly opposed.
There are thousands, tens of thousands of Jews in this country who are terrified about what is happening because of people like you who are basically saying you support terrorist organizations that don't think that Israel or the Jewish people have a right to exist.
The terrorist organization is the Israeli regime. They are the terrorists.
They're a democratically elected government. They're a democratically elected government. They are not a prescribed terrorist organization, which Hamas is.
Because the Palestinians living in Israel have not got a vote. So don't give me that nonsense about.
There are plenty of Arabs. No, if you're not an Israeli national, and there are plenty of Arab Israelis who are, you do have a vote in Israel.
Well, I'm sorry, Julia. You need to actually look that there are tens of thousands, if not millions, of Palestinians living in the area outside of Gaza, who do not have a vote. And indeed, it's an absolutely apartheid regime. There's no doubt about that.
It's an apartheid regime. It's not an apartheid regime. I mean, for goodness sake,
in
what way is Israel is not an apartheid regime? There is nothing you can...
Hold on a minute. Salem, which is...
In Aleppo, when we watch when we hear something like this and we put our arms in front of our mouths and we say, wow. I have no comment about this, and one of the commentators say Hitler was also democratically elected.
I mean, it's you know, you're right. I mean, even if you're not listening to the points that Chris is very courageously making under this incredible attack. I mean, you know, we've seen basically Zionist-aligned journalists in the West behaving in this way. I mean, it's been quite extraordinary. She actually makes Piers Morgan look quite rational, and that's unusual. But what I found extraordinary was the body language. One, she kept looking towards something or someone, as if she was looking for validation, right? And then at one point, her arm is like, I don't know if she's actually hitting something or what she's doing, but it's quite extraordinary. I mean, that's not journalism. I can't even call it bias because it's way beyond bias.
It's a war crime. It was a war crime. They're committing war crimes.
With war crimes, basically. Yeah. Defense of war crimes.
As you said, Piers Morgan looks like a liberal, progressive, pro-Palestinian figure compared to her. Wow! What is this?
Yeah, I mean, you know, and I know Chris. I mean, he's an incredibly kind of rational, calm guy who's been hounded
Hmm.
for his political views, for his defense of the trade unions, but in particular, of course, for his defense of the Palestinian cause. He was hounded out of British politics. And as was Jeremy Corbyn, of course, by the entire kind of Zionist lobby in the UK. And, you know, the thing is that the question that I am raising more recently is, who are our politicians, our governments? Who is their allegiance to? Is their allegiance to our national security, meaning Germany's or the UK's or the US's? Or is it Israel's security that takes priority? For me right now, what I'm seeing is their allegiance to Israel, not to Israelis. That's a very important point to make, right?
Yes.
Because I think for the West, Israeli lives are just as expendable as Palestinian lives, for the benefit of US, UK hegemony and their global agenda, particularly in the Middle East. And Kennedy's recent statement, where he makes it, Robert Kennedy Jr., where he makes it absolutely clear why he defends the Zionist state. And again, you know,
yes,
people need to. He's honest. It's a bit like Trump saying we're only in Syria to take the oil. You know, it's kind of, it's the same honesty, but it's still kind of shocking that effectively he admits that they defend Israel because Israel is their eyes and ears in the region. Israel is their tool for interference in the region. Israel is their prevention of the BRICS country dominance of the region, right? So he makes it very clear why they defend the Israeli project, the Zionist project. And why do I make that definition? Because the Zionist project was initially instigated by the British, that basically signed Palestinian territory over to Rothschild and to the Zionist movement. And the Zionist movement in the late 1890s was even described by Jews as another anti-Semitic cult.
Hmm.
So the majority of Jews that I speak to, both the Mizrahim Jews, as they're called, or the Sephardic Jews inside the occupied territories, and the Jews that live outside and that have been taking part in the Palestinian solidarity protests across the world, really, don't actually support the Zionist project. And for them, they feel it would be safer to live in a Palestinian state with Palestinians and Jews, with Muslims, Jews, and Christians together in a Palestinian state. So that's a very important definition to make, because what they do in the West, and what Julia Hartley-Brewer did, of course, was to conflate Zionism with Judaism. Actually, when many Judaic followers would actually say Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism.
Yes, when we were last week in this pro-Palestinian demo, there were so many Jewish people holding a banner that I'm a Jewish, and not in my name, I oppose the Israeli government, Zionism, and all this stuff. And if you go to pro-Israeli demo, for example, you do not see from the other side, let's say Arabic people or Palestinian people or Muslim people coming to pro-Israeli demonstrations and saying,
or even Christians. You see the evangelical, of course, and then you get into the subject of
but
the
Vanessa,
Zionist Christian cult. Of course.
Yeah, but mostly the Christians who are participating in these pro-Israeli demonstrations. This is just my subjective opinion, right? From what I see, they are from the older generation and the younger generation. Let's say the early 20s and 30s. In the era of social media, people cannot really see this imagery and this footage coming from the Gaza Strip and just be say, okay, let's continue our lives. No, they are really enraged, and what caught me of surprise is the left, let's say. I was one of the people, I was criticizing that the left has lost its path and their priorities have changed. And I was saying, well, we have to focus on anti-imperialism. We have to focus on the working class rights instead of gender ideology and the LGBT, etc., etc. But now it seems that there is a reshift again, and the left wingers were the majority in these demos, which I went and I saw the photos, for example, in Europe and especially in Berlin. But because you mentioned RFK, I just want to show the audience what you meant about the RFK's recent statement. He says, Israel is a stronghold for us. It's like having an aircraft carrier in the Middle East. If Israel disappears, Russia, China, and the BRICS plus countries will control 90% of the world's oil, and this will be a disaster. Let's take a look together.
And Israel is critical. And the reason it's critical is because it's a bulwark for us in the Mideast. It's almost like having an aircraft carrier in the Mideast. It's our oldest ally. It's been our ally for 75 years. It has been an incredible ally for us in terms of the technology, the exchange. And, in building the Iron Dome, which we paid a lot for, has also taught us enormously about how to defend ourselves at home from missiles. So those military expenditures are all going, 75% of it goes to U.S. companies under the agreement, under the MOU. But if you look at what's happening in the Mideast now, Iran is now the closest allies to Iran are Russia and China. Iran also controls all of Venezuela's oil. Hezbollah is in Venezuela. They have propped up the Maduro regime, and so they control that oil supply. BRICS, Saudi Arabia is now joining BRICS. So those countries will control 90% of the oil in the world. If Israel disappears, the vacuum in the Mideast, which is, Israel is our ambassador, it's our presence, our beachhead in the Mideast, and it gives us ears and eyes in the Mideast. It gives us intelligence. It gives us the capacity to influence affairs in the Mideast. If Israel disappears, Russia and China would be controlling the Mideast, and they control 90% of the world's oil supply, and that would be cataclysmic for U.S. national security. So that's the answer.
What happened to RFK? All of a sudden, in every other topic, you feel like this guy he's using his brain, and when it comes to Israel, he turns into a neocon.
Yeah, it's quite incredible. But I mean, he's been. I mean, I have to give him credit. He's been more open in that statement than I think any other American congressperson or potential president has for decades, right? About the US kind of symbiotic, parasitical relationship between Israel and the US. And, I mean, what is this all about? Of course, this is about preventing Russian, Iranian, Chinese influence in the Middle East. But of course, the wars that the West has waged against the Middle East has effectively pushed them further and further to the East and away from the West. So by their foreign policy, their military adventurism, they've actually, achieved exactly what they feared the most, which is the expansion of Chinese and Russian and Iranian influence in the countries that they perceive as the commodity bloc. And this is where their fear lies, of course, because what's happening now, all the commodity bloc countries are splitting away from the US. I mean, I think Saudi Arabia is still very much in the middle, and it's playing a bit of a dirty double game in the sense that it's bringing down, or it's offering air defenses to bring down Yemeni missiles, etc. But nevertheless, the commodity bloc is shifting away from the West. And that is literally what they're terrified of, because if they lose the commodity bloc, they lose the control of global resources, right? Then what do they become? They become a service country that has to trade normally to buy commodities from the commodity bloc. That's anathema to the existence of the US cartel, right? Because their existence depends on global unipolar supremacy.
Yes, hegemony and suppression.
Israel is pivotal, and extraordinary there that he says, Israel is effectively, as he said, their aircraft carrier, but allows them to influence affairs in the Middle East. Well, Syria, of all countries, knows exactly what that means. Even now, Israel is backing the separatist movement in the south and bombing Syrian territory on a regular basis, including since October the 7th, the airports of Aleppo and Damascus that are still not operational, as far as I know. As far as I know, they're not back in operation yet.
I think the Syrian side should not declare that the airport is operational, otherwise Israel will bomb it again. So keep it secret if it's working or not. Every time they say it's been repaired, and we start the departure today, and the second day Israel bombs it again. And by the way, speaking about the support for Israel, yesterday there was the Republican presidential debate, and there is a very short video of how the rest of the Republican candidates are speaking about Israel. And it just seems to me that there is a contest between these candidates to prove who is more pro-Israeli. Let's check.
President of the United States, what would you be urging Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to do at this moment? Governor DeSantis.
I would be telling Bibi, finish the job once and for all with these butchers, Hamas.
The first thing I said when it happened was I said, finish them. Finish them.
I would tell him to smoke those terrorists on his southern border, and then I'll tell him as president of the United States, I'll be smoking the terrorists on our southern border.
If you want to stop the 40+ attacks on military personnel in the Middle East, you have to strike in Iran.
As president.
Today, when I watched this video, I had the impression that somebody implanted a chip in their brain, and there is a software, and there is a software that they have all to say the same thing or worse from each other.
It's literally like we're dealing with transhumans, right? I mean, it's just becoming, it's becoming bizarre. I mean, even in the UK, we have Labour and Conservative both saying the same thing. I mean, Starmer has allied himself so closely to what Rishi Sunak is saying. And of course, if we look at the leadership in the UK, I mean, you have Rishi Sunak, whose wife, both of which are millionaires, but his wife is one of the, or rather, I can't remember which member of her family was the founder of the kind of surveillance company and AI and all the rest of it, Infosys. Well, Infosys has an independent director, which is Uri Levine, who was a member of the 8200, the shadowy spy unit of the Israeli forces, right? That's that. Then you have Braverman, Suella Braverman, who's the Home Secretary, and who, of course, is calling all Palestinian, pro-Palestinian marches hate marches. Yes. She's calling for prescribing the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as terrorists. She as a Home Secretary, she afforded millions to an organization called the Community Security Trust, which is one of the Zionist front groups that hounded, for example, Professor David Miller out of Bristol University, led the witch hunt against Jeremy Corbyn and Chris Williamson. So she's given them millions, as did Priti Patel, who of course was called out going on a secret trip to Israel and basically redirecting charity funds to the Israeli occupation forces. And Braverman, her husband is a Zionist. She's admitted that in an article in Jewish Chronicle. Many of their close family members, again, she said this, are members of the IOF. She herself always wears the Zionist flag entwined with the British flag, but it's her rhetoric which makes me question where her allegiance lies, because Iran is not a threat to the national security of Britain, right? It's a threat to the national security of Israel, because Iran has always been very clear on its stance regarding the Palestinian cause, as is Yemen, Syria, all the axis of resistance. And she's, the policies that she's wanting to push through do nothing for the security the national security of Great Britain. They do everything for the national security of Israel.
Yes.
So as I said, you know, when you combine that with the kind of rhetoric that's coming out of both Republicans and Democrats in the US, then I think it becomes very clear that defense of Israel is
Yeah, I just the last word, the defense of Israel. We didn't hear just the last word from you, I think.
the defense of Israel.
Yeah, the last word. Yeah, I think it's unsurprising now after this explanation that you made why there are, of course, ideological reasons, political reasons, but mostly geopolitical reasons. And some politicians also, they want to keep their careers. And we all know that, like, if you wanna at least, if you want to become anti-Zionist or anti-Israeli, or just try to say that Palestinians have the right to statehood or dignified life, you will lose your job, you will lose your career. And this is not only exclusive to the political class, but also the journalistic class nowadays. It's very difficult for independent journalists like yourself to survive in such an environment. Guys, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the Substack of Vanessa is in the description below. And I also pinned the article that she recently published about the human shield narrative of Israel in the live chat. Please go read it. There are so many details in it, so many sources, and also videos inside it. And share it on your social media platforms. It's free to share it, but when you do it, you are sharing information and you're sharing a counter narrative. This is very important. If our voices were not influential, they wouldn't mind to suppress or deplatform people from social media platforms. Try to do it mostly on X, because X is the place still people are able to speak relatively free. But I recommend you guys to of the article and then put the link under the screenshot. This is the best way to push a Substack article on Twitter or X, because otherwise the algorithm suppresses the visibility, let's say, of these articles. Other than that, I will also add the X account of Vanessa in the description below when this live streaming is over. Vanessa, in Arabic, we say "Ma bin shaba' minnek," which means I wouldn't get enough of talking with you. I'm sure the audience were here, like, the audience was celebrating here that you're here with me. And Syriana analysis, calling you a brave journalist and the light of truth and everything. I saw tens of messages and comments. Guys, support independent journalists. And Vanessa, we'll see you soon. Thank you so much again for being my guest today.
Thanks for having me on, Kevork. Take care.
It's a great pleasure. Guys, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate all of you and all your support and comments. And also, I would like to thank again Black Tie for his generous support all the time for the content of Syriana Analysis. If you want to support my independent work, you can see the link here on the screen. Syriana Analysis, it's on Patreon, patreon.com/Syriana Analysis. It's a great way also for supporting my work. And now I will leave you again with the intro video, which I really liked, this Julian Assange video, and I will see you tomorrow.
I don't need to tell you the depravity of war. You are all too familiar with its images, with the refugees of war, with information that we have revealed showing the everyday squalor and barbarity of war. Information such as the individual deaths of over 130,000 people in Iraq. Individual deaths that were kept secret by the US military, who denied that they ever counted the deaths of civilians. Instead, I want to tell you what I think is the way that wars come to be and that wars can be undone. In democracies, or the pseudo-democracies that we are evolving into, wars are a result of lies. The Vietnam War and the push for US involvement was a result of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. A lie. The Iraq War famously is a result of lies. Wars in Somalia are a result of lies. The Second World War and the German invasion of Poland was a result of carefully constructed lies. That is war by media. Let us ask ourselves, of the complicit media, which is the majority of the mainstream press, what is the average death count attributed to each journalist? When we understand that wars come about as a result of lies peddled to the British public and the American public and the publics all over Europe and other countries, then who are the war criminals? It is not just leaders, it is not just soldiers, it is journalists. Journalists are war criminals. And why one might think that that should lead us to a state of despair, that the reality that is constructed around us is constructed by liars, is constructed by people who are close to those that they are meant to be policing. It should lead us also to an optimistic understanding, because if wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by truth. So that is our task, and it is your task. Go and get the truth. Get into the ballpark and get the ball, and give it to us, and we'll spread it all over the world.